The chandeliers sparkled overhead, casting golden reflections across the vast hall. Hundreds of eyes shifted as the doors at the far end opened. In stepped Emily Carter, her uniform pressed to perfection, her chest decorated with a row of medals that seemed to glint even brighter under the unforgiving lights. The echo of her boots against the polished floor was sharp, commanding, as though each step carried the weight of history. For a brief moment, the room fell into silence, a kind of silence that comes when people witness something or someone extraordinary. Yet the silence didn't last. Murmurs began to spread like ripples across still water. Whispers curled around her name, circling through rows of seats, whispered from lips that carried both admiration and doubt. "She doesn't look like the type," one man muttered to his companion. "Those medals? I heard they aren't even real." Another voice whispered, hushed but audible. Emily heard them. She always did. Years of training had sharpened her senses, and she could distinguish the sound of doubt even in a crowded room. But she didn't falter. Her gaze remained steady, her chin lifted with quiet pride. The medals pinned to her uniform weren't decorations for vanity. Each one was a reminder of sacrifice, of nights spent in foreign deserts, of blood spilled and lives saved. She moved further into the hall, the cameras already trained on her. Flashbulbs flickered, catching the shimmer of gold and silver across her chest. Journalists scribbled into their notebooks with anticipation. Some had already decided their headlines before the ceremony began. Hero or fraud? The truth about Emily Carter. Emily's eyes scanned the room, searching. Among the faces of politicians, military officers, reporters, and citizens, she saw a handful of familiar once fellow veterans she had served with, men and women who bore their own scars of war. They nodded to her, subtle gestures of respect, solidarity. But beyond them, she saw skepticism written plainly on others' faces. They didn't believe her story. They didn't believe she had earned what she wore. Every step she took toward the stage carried not only her own weight, but the weight of her reputation. Doubt had followed her for months, spreading like wildfire through media channels, fed by whispers from those who had never set foot in battle. They questioned how one woman could have achieved so much in so little time. They questioned the silence in official records about missions she had allegedly led. They questioned whether her medals were real or carefully fabricated lies. Emily's heart pounded, but her expression revealed none of it. She had been under fire before, in places where bullets whistled overhead and explosions shook the earth beneath her boots. Compared to that, the sting of whispers felt almost trivial, except this battlefield was different. This was a war of perception, and perception could wound deeper than bullets. As she neared the stage, she caught sight of a journalist in the front row. His eyes were sharp, predatory, his notebook already filled with lines prepared to shred her reputation. Their gazes met briefly, and she could almost hear his unspoken accusation. "Prove it." Her throat tightened, but she pressed forward. The hall itself seemed to close in, every step magnified by the tension pressing against her shoulders. She thought of the medals again. The Bronze Star, awarded after she dragged 3 injured comrades from a burning convoy under direct fire. The Purple Heart, pinned to her chest after shrapnel tore through her leg during a rescue mission in Kandahar. The Medal of Valor, a recognition so rare it was spoken of with reverence, earned after she led a night raid that saved civilians from an ambush. She hadn't asked for these medals. They had been given, sometimes reluctantly, by superiors who couldn't deny her courage despite the quiet disapproval of others who thought her achievements too extraordinary for someone like her. And yet, here she was, forced once again to stand trial before doubters. The hall's atmosphere thickened as she approached the podium. Every eye followed her, and though applause broke out, it was scattered, hesitant. For every person who clapped with genuine admiration, another sat stiff, arms crossed, expression skeptical. Emily inhaled slowly. This was more than a ceremony. This was Judgment Day. Her mind flickered back to the desert nights she had endured. The suffocating heat, the bone-deep exhaustion, the sight of fellow soldiers lying wounded in the sand. She remembered the sound of radio chatter, the calls for backup, the moments when she had to make decisions that determined who lived and who didn't. Those memories were burned into her soul, more permanent than the medals she wore. And yet, none of that was visible here. To the audience, she was a decorated soldier standing beneath chandeliers, in a hall polished and pristine, so far removed from the grit of war. They saw the medals, but not the battles. They saw the uniform, but not the scars beneath it. A woman in the crowd leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She looks too calm. If she really did all that, she'd be different. Broken, maybe." Emily caught the words. Calm? Yes, she was calm now. But broken? She had been broken 100 times, and she had rebuilt herself each time, piece by piece. That was the part no medal could show. At the podium, Emily paused, resting her hands lightly on the wood. She could feel the anticipation. Cameras zoomed in. Every angle of her face would be analyzed, every flicker of expression dissected. She lifted her chin slightly and looked out at the audience. This was where her story began to unravel or to be stitched back together. The master of ceremonies began speaking, introducing her achievements in broad strokes. But even as he spoke, Emily could hear the restless shifting in the crowd, the coughs, the whispered questions. The applause that followed his words felt hollow. She didn't need applause. She needed truth. And yet, truth had a way of being drowned out in rooms like this. Her eyes moved again to the veterans seated off to one side. They knew. They had been there, seen her in action, watched her take risks others wouldn't dare. Their expressions told her to stand firm. Emily straightened her posture. She wouldn't let whispers define her. She wouldn't let doubt erase her sacrifices. The ceremony was supposed to honor her, but she could feel the trial in every glance, every whisper. This wasn't celebration. It was a cross-examination. Still, she was here. She had walked through fire before. She could walk through this. The murmurs didn't fade. They grew. The journalist in the front row leaned forward, ready to pounce. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. She said nothing for now. The air in the hall grew heavy, as though everyone was waiting for the moment when rumor and truth would finally collide. Emily Carter, the woman whose medals glinted defiantly under the lights, stood at the podium. And though her story had yet to be told, one thing was already clear. This was no ordinary ceremony. This was the opening of a battle she had never chosen, but one she would not lose. The applause that greeted Emily at the podium dwindled into an uneasy silence. The hall, elegant with marble pillars and velvet curtains, should have felt grand, inspiring, a place where honor was celebrated. But Emily could feel the undercurrent of doubt ripple beneath its polished surface, like a hidden current threatening to pull her under. The first murmur rose from the middle rows, quiet, subtle, yet unmistakable. She's too young for all that. She couldn't have been everywhere they say she was. Emily's eyes stayed forward, her jaw set. Years in uniform had taught her the discipline of stillness. On the battlefield, stillness could mean survival. Here, stillness was her shield. Against an audience dissecting every detail of her presence. More whispers followed. A pair of older officers leaned close together, their decorations gleaming. One raised an eyebrow, the other smirked. Their expressions said more than words. Disbelief wrapped in condescension. She was just a logistics officer, wasn't she? One man whispered. Paperwork doesn't win you a Medal of Valor, came the reply. Emily's ears picked up fragments, each cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. It was strange, she thought. In war, she had faced gunfire, shrapnel, explosions. Yet here, in a hall meant to honor service, the sting of doubt cut sharper than any bullet. Her eyes shifted briefly toward the journalists lining the front rows. They weren't whispering. They didn't need to. Their pens scratched furiously. Their cameras flashed in bursts, their hungry eyes scanning her for flaws. She recognized one of them immediately, Daniel Rhodes. He had written the most scathing articles about her in the past weeks, questioning how one woman could possibly achieve such accolades. Rhodes leaned forward in his seat, scribbling notes, the corner of his mouth curved in a faint smirk, as if already savoring the headline. Hero's facade crumbles under scrutiny. Emily inhaled slowly, silently. She couldn't let him or anyone see. The weight pressing down on her chest. Her medals gleamed proudly under the chandeliers, but she could feel them growing heavier by the minute, as though the doubt in the room seeped into the metal. Her mind drifted, unbidden, back to the desert. Kandahar. The memory rose clear, as if she were there again, the suffocating heat, the stench of smoke, the screams of the injured. She remembered crawling under a vehicle with bullets sparking. Off its frame, dragging a soldier whose leg was shredded by shrapnel. She remembered the fire, the chaos, the blood. That day had earned her one of the very medals now questioned. That day was seared into her memory, the pain so vivid she could almost feel it in her scar. And yet, none of them knew. None of them believed. The murmurs thickened, turning the atmosphere of the hall into something suffocating. People shifted. In their seats, some avoiding her eyes, others staring as though they could peel away layers of her story by sheer suspicion. She looks too composed. Real soldiers don't walk like that. They carry themselves differently. Her file doesn't even mention half the missions she claims. Emily wanted to laugh bitterly at that one. Of course, her file didn't. Half her missions had been buried in classified reports, sealed away in government archives never meant for public eyes. How could she prove what she wasn't allowed to reveal? Her fingers brushed the podium's edge. She could feel the tension buzzing through her veins like electricity. Part of her wanted to shout, to lay bare the memories etched into her mind. Comrades she had carried out of burning vehicles, the civilians she had shielded with her own body, the missions she had led in silence. But she stayed still. Stillness was survival. A cough echoed from the back, then more murmurs rose, layered on top of each other. The audience was becoming restless. Some looked bored, already writing her off as a fraud. Others leaned forward, with curiosity, waiting for something explosive, an admission, a crack, a confrontation. Emily's gaze drifted to the veterans seated at the far side of the hall. Unlike the others, they didn't whisper. They didn't doubt. Their eyes carried a weight, she recognized, the look of those who had seen battle, who had stood at the edge of death and returned. They didn't need proof. They already knew. A subtle nod from one of them, a grizzled man with a cane, steadied her. But the doubt wasn't going away. If anything, it was spreading. The master of ceremonies continued speaking, but his words fell flat against the thick atmosphere. Every sentence about Emily's service, every mention of valor and bravery, was drowned out by the audience's disbelief. She could almost hear the skepticism growing louder in their minds. And then, a woman's voice rang clear from the second row. Not loud, but distinct enough to cut through. If she's really a hero, why do none of us know the details? Gasps rippled. The question was blunt, daring. Emily felt the heat rise in her chest. Her medals, each tied to a story of blood and sacrifice, now seemed invisible to them, as though they were props on a stage. Daniel Rhodes scribbled furiously, his smirk widening. Emily steadied herself again. She thought of another mission she had never spoken about. A village raid in the dead of night, civilians trapped, enemies waiting. She had led her unit through the chaos, shielded children with her own body, taken fire, kept moving. The memory was hers, carved deep into her soul, but it lived nowhere in public record. It was the kind of truth she could never voice aloud, because some truths were too entangled in secrecy. The whispers continued to rise. They no longer felt like background noise. They were a tide, swelling, pressing against her, threatening to drown her under suspicion. She's hiding something. She can't prove it. She doesn't deserve this. Emily's chest tightened. She wasn't afraid of bullets, of bombs, of enemies lurking in the shadows. But this silent attack on her honor, it cut differently, deeply. Her hands curled into fists against the podium, though her face remained calm. She had to remain calm. If she broke here, they'd win. The doubters, the skeptics, the ones who wanted her exposed as a fraud, they would feast on her weakness. But she would not give them that. Instead, she lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping the hall. She met the eyes of those whispering. She met Daniel Rhodes's piercing stare. She met the woman who had questioned her legitimacy. And she didn't look away. For a moment, the whispers faltered. Just a moment. But the damage was done. Doubt had taken root, and the audience was restless. The weight of it pressed harder on her shoulders. Emily Carter, decorated soldier, war veteran, hero, stood alone at the podium, her truth unseen, her honor under siege. And though she had faced fire before, she knew this battle was only beginning. The tension in the hall had reached a breaking point. The murmurs were no longer subtle. They buzzed through the air like restless bees. Every pair of eyes seemed to be studying Emily, waiting for something, an explanation, a falter, a confession. She stood at the podium, steady, medals glinting defiantly under the chandeliers. Her silence was strength, but to those already doubting, it looked like hesitation. And then it happened. From the front row, a chair scraped sharply against the polished floor. Daniel Rhodes, the journalist whose pen had carved doubts into newspapers across the nation, rose to his feet. The hall quieted almost instantly. His reputation preceded him, relentless, merciless, always chasing stories that stirred outrage. His voice cut through the silence, crisp and sharp as a blade. "Miss Carter," he began, deliberately avoiding her rank. "These medals you wear so proudly, are they real honors or carefully constructed lies?" The question echoed across the hall. Gasps rippled through the audience. Cameras swiveled, microphones angled forward. Reporters leaned closer, eager for the drama unfolding. Emily froze for a heartbeat. Not because she didn't expect it, she had known Rhodes would strike eventually, but because of the way he asked it, stripping her of her title, her service, her respect. Her eyes met his. His were cold, calculating, but beneath them shimmered the faintest glint of hunger. He wasn't here for truth. He was here for spectacle. She could feel the shift in the room. The whispers were gone, replaced by heavy silence. Everyone wanted to hear her answer. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythm too loud, too fast. Her throat felt dry, but she forced her voice steady. "Every medal I wear," she said, each word deliberate, "was earned in service to my country." Rhodes tilted his head, smirking. "That's a nice line, but the records don't match your story. Missions unaccounted for. Actions no one can verify. Isn't it convenient that so much of your heroism lives in classified files, away from public scrutiny?" A wave of murmurs surged through the hall. Heads turned. The words classified and convenient stuck in the air like poison. Emily's grip on the podium tightened. She could almost hear the crack of gunfire in her memory, smell the acrid smoke of burning vehicles, feel the searing pain of shrapnel tearing through her leg. Those weren't stories. They weren't fabrications. They were scars carved into her very being. But how did she explain that to people who had never left the comfort of safety? How did she prove sacrifices that were buried in reports stamped top secret? Her silence stretched too long. Rhodes seized it. "You've built a reputation as a national hero," he pressed, his voice louder now. "But isn't it true that much of your so-called bravery can't be confirmed? Isn't it true that you've exaggerated or worse fabricated events to elevate yourself?" The hall erupted. Gasps, whispers, cameras flashing like lightning. Some in the audience looked at Emily with narrowed eyes, suspicion hardening. Others leaned back, shocked at the boldness of the accusation. The master of ceremonies tried to interject, but Rhodes pushed past him, his voice commanding the room. He smelled blood, and he wasn't going to let go. Emily's chest burned. Anger, sharp and hot, surged inside her. She had faced insurgents, hostage-takers, ambushes in the dead of night. And yet, this man, this civilian, who had never known the taste of sand in his teeth or the sting of combat, was questioning her honor as if it were a political scandal to unravel. She wanted to shout, to slam her fist on the podium and recount every life she had saved, every night she had lain awake, listening for threats, every time she had risked her life for those who would never know her name. But shouting wasn't strength. Shouting would give him what he wanted, a spectacle. Instead, she steadied her breathing. "Mr. Rhodes," she said finally, her voice calm, though her heart thundered. "The missions I took part in were not designed for publicity. They were designed to save lives. And sometimes, the details of those missions are not meant to be splashed across headlines." A few claps rose from the veterans section, small but firm. But elsewhere, doubt lingered. The silence that followed was heavier than before, and Rhodes smiled faintly, knowing he had struck deep. He wasn't finished. He lifted a sheet of paper from his notebook, holding it aloft. "This is your service record, Miss Carter. Nowhere does it mention half the missions that supposedly earned you these medals. Would you like to explain the discrepancy?" Emily's breath caught. He had a copy of her official record, the version scrubbed clean for public release. The classified missions, the rescues, the ambush she had survived, they weren't there. She knew they wouldn't be. But to the audience, it looked damning. Voices broke out across the hall. "She can't explain it. It doesn't add up. She's hiding something." Emily's vision blurred for a moment. Not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The years she had spent in silence, carrying memories no one else could understand, now being twisted into lies. Her eyes darted to the veterans again. They sat forward, tense, ready to speak if needed. One of them, the man with the cane, looked as if he might rise. But Emily gave the slightest shake of her head. Not yet. This was her battle. She turned back to Rhodes. "There are truths," she said quietly, "that don't live on paper. And if you think a missing line in a document erases blood spilled on foreign soil, then you've never understood sacrifice." Her words hung in the air, sharp and clear. For a moment, the hall seemed to hold its breath. But then Rhodes chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's not an answer," he said, his tone tripping with dismissal. The sting was immediate. Emily's chest tightened, her fists clenched at her sides. Around her, the audience stirred, caught between sympathy and suspicion. Cameras flashed again, desperate to capture the moment. A hero's reputation teetered on the edge. Inside, Emily felt the familiar fire of combat rise. She had faced worse. She had survived worse. This man could question her honor, but he couldn't take away what she had lived through. And she would not break. Not here. Not now. Her silence, this time, wasn't hesitation. It was defiance. She locked eyes with Rhodes and held his stare until he finally lowered himself back into his seat, smug but unsettled by her unyielding gaze. The hall buzzed with uncertainty. The accusation had been made, the seed of doubt planted deeper. The audience was restless, shifting, waiting for more. And Emily Carter, standing at the podium, knew this was only the beginning. The battle for her honor had begun in earnest, and she would have to fight every whisper, every glance, every word until the truth was undeniable. Emily gripped the edge of the podium, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The room around her buzzed with whispers, the aftermath of Daniel Rhodes's attack still thick in the air. Her medals caught the light, flashing like accusations, rather than honors. She wanted to speak, to fight back, to strip the doubt from their faces with the raw, unfiltered truth. But the truth wasn't hers to give freely. Too much of her story lived in classified files, sealed behind walls of secrecy. She was bound by silence, trapped by the very service that had earned her the medals now in question. Her chest tightened. Her throat felt parched. She needed a moment. She stepped back from the podium, away from the blinding lights and the stares. A low murmur rippled through the audience at her retreat. To some, it looked like weakness. To others, avoidance. To her, it was survival. Emily found a chair near the side of the stage and lowered herself slowly, her movements stiff with the weight of eyes that followed. She let her gaze drop for the first time, staring at her boots, at the scuff marks on the polished leather that no amount of cleaning could erase. And then the memories came. The hall around her blurred, its chandeliers and velvet curtains dissolving. Into heat and sand, she was back in Kandahar. The sky was thick with smoke, the air filled with the stench of burning fuel. Gunfire cracked in the distance, and the ground shook under the pounding of mortar. She remembered the weight of another soldier's arm slung across her shoulders as she dragged him to safety. His blood had soaked into her uniform, hot and heavy, a reminder of how fragile life was. She had earned one of her medals that night, but no one here could see that. Her breath grew shallow as the memories surged. The convoy explosion, the raid in the dead of night, the time she had thrown herself into the line of fire to shield civilians. Each memory carried both pride and pain, carved deep into her soul. Each one was invisible to the people now questioning her. A voice echoed in her mind her commanding officer on the radio that night in Kandahar. "Carter, you're hit. Fall back." Her reply had been instant, firm. "Not until I've got him out." That had been her truth. That had been her reality. But in this hall, under the gaze of strangers, it was just a story she wasn't allowed to tell. Emily pressed her palms against her knees, trying to steady herself. She hated this feeling, the helplessness of being misunderstood, the frustration of carrying proof in scars and memories while the world demanded paperwork. The hall was still buzzing. She could feel it, even with her eyes lowered. They thought her silence was weakness. They thought her retreat was guilt. But it wasn't guilt she carried. It was exhaustion. She had spent years pushing through pain, through fear, through the crushing weight of war. And now she was being asked to prove it all, as if courage only mattered when it was visible to an audience. Her eyes lifted, just for a moment, toward the veterans seated nearby. Their faces were steady, supportive. They knew. They had lived through the same silence. Some of their own medals had stories hidden behind locked files. They, too, had faced doubt from those who couldn't understand. A flicker of strength stirred inside her. But then, another memory struck. The ambush in the mountains. Her unit had been pinned down, enemies firing from above. She had crawled across jagged rocks, her hands bleeding to flank the attackers. The night had been lit by gunfire, her ears ringing with the screams of her comrades. By the time it was over, she had led survivors out, their lives owed to her decision. That mission had been buried under classified reports. No one outside her unit ever knew. Emily blinked hard. That memory had followed her into her dreams, haunting her with what-ifs. Yet to the audience in this hall, it didn't exist. She clenched her jaw. Did they have any idea what it was like to live with ghosts? To remember the names of the ones she couldn't save? To wear medals not as ornaments, but as anchors, each one tied to a night she wished she could forget? Her reflection deepened. She thought of her mother, back home in Virginia, who never asked about the medals. Her mother only asked if Emily was eating, if she was sleeping, if she was happy. Emily could never tell her the truth, that happiness had been replaced by survival, that the war never really left her, that even in silence, the battles raged on. Her eyes burned, but she forced back the tears. Heroes didn't cry in public. Not here, not now. The master of ceremonies leaned toward her, whispering something, but she barely heard. Her mind was wrapped in a storm of memories and doubts, all colliding at once. She wanted to scream the truth at the top of her lungs. She wanted to pull open her uniform, show them the scars etched into her skin, the evidence written in flesh and bone. She wanted to tell them about the nights when she had stared at the ceiling, haunted by the faces of the fallen, whispering apologies into the dark. But she didn't, because part of her knew it wouldn't matter. People believed what they wanted. To believe, to some, medals were proof. To others, they were lies, and no story, no scar, could change a mind already set. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. Her breath trembled, but she held it until her chest steadied. Slowly, she opened her eyes again. The hall sharpened back into focus. The chandeliers, the velvet curtains, the restless audience, all of it returned. The whispers were still there, like a chorus of doubt. But so was the truth, heavy in her chest, undeniable to her. Emily straightened in her chair. She wasn't broken. Not yet. The doubts hurt, yes. They cut deep, reopening wounds she thought had scarred over. But they didn't erase her truth. They didn't erase what she had done, what she had sacrificed, what she had lived through. She thought again of the soldier she had dragged from the burning convoy, the weight of him across her shoulders, his blood staining her uniform. He had lived. That was real. That was all the proof she needed. Her gaze shifted back to the audience. Some stared at her with suspicion, some with curiosity, a few with quiet respect. And for the first time since Rhodes's attack, Emily allowed herself a small, steady smile. Not of arrogance, not of triumph, but of resilience. She was still standing. And though the world doubted her, she knew her truth. The hall still buzzed with unease. Emily's silence lingered like a shadow. Her earlier words drowned beneath Rhodes's accusations. To most in the audience, the silence seemed damning. To Emily, it was a wall she had to build around secrets that were never hers to reveal. She sat rigid in her chair, her medals glinting, the whispers clawing at her. Doubt had spread like wildfire fueled by Rhodes, fanned by curiosity and thickened by ignorance. Then, the scrape of another chair echoed across the hall. From the veterans section, an older man pushed himself upright, leaning heavily. On a cane, his uniform was neatly pressed, though worn with age. His hair was silver, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes burned with the kind of fire only battle could forge. The murmurs hushed instantly. "I served with her?" The man's voice rang, gravelly but strong. Heads turned toward him. "Kandahar." The convoy attack. Emily froze. Her throat tightened. She knew his voice, even after years. Sergeant William Hayes. He had been in that convoy, bleeding in the sand when she dragged him out. "She carried me through fire," Hayes continued, his cane trembling as he leaned on it. "Bullets were flying, vehicles burning. I thought I was done. But he pointed at Emily, his hand shaking. She lifted me out of hell and got me home. Don't you dare tell me those medals are lies." The hall erupted. Gasps, whispers. Some clapped before stopping themselves, as if unsure if applause was permitted. Emily's chest burned, her eyes wet. Hayes's words weren't polished, weren't rehearsed. They were raw, jagged with truth. Before the noise settled, another voice rose. A woman, middle-aged, her uniform adorned with her own hard-earned ribbons. She stood tall, her voice unwavering. "Operation Iron Shield," she said firmly. "We were outnumbered, pinned down. Carter led the counterattack. If not for her, half of us wouldn't be here today." The crowd shifted. The whispers faltered. Emily's mind reeled. She hadn't expected this. She had told herself she would face this alone. But here they were, her brothers and sisters, in arms standing when she couldn't. Another veteran. Rose, this one younger, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the hall further. "We were clearing a village. Ambush hit us hard. Civilians trapped. Carter went in first. She shielded a boy with her own body, took shrapnel for it. That's the medal you see on her chest. I patched her up myself." Emily's vision blurred. She blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Each word cut through the doubt like steel through paper. These weren't rumors. These weren't headlines. These were living testimonies. The veterans began to rise one by one, as if compelled by a force stronger than doubt. Each carried a story. Each spoke with conviction. She stayed behind when the chopper lifted, wouldn't leave until everyone else was safe. She radioed for support while under fire saved 2 squads. She held pressure on my wound for hours, even after being hit herself. The audience was stunned. The room, once filled with skepticism, now swelled with truth spoken aloud. Even those who had doubted most leaned forward, their expressions softening, curiosity shifting into awe. Daniel Rhodes scribbled furiously, but his smirk was gone. His eyes darted, uneasy, as if realizing his narrative was unraveling. Emily sat frozen, her hand over her mouth. These missions were never meant to be spoken of, not here, not now. Yet her comrades didn't speak of strategy or secrets. They spoke of humanity. They spoke of her courage, her selflessness, the lives she had touched directly. No classified report could silence that. The master of ceremonies tried to regain control, but the veterans weren't done. Sergeant Hayes's voice cut through once more, trembling but fierce. "You people look at medals and see metal. We look at them and see blood, sweat, sacrifice. I've seen men pin medals on themselves. They didn't earn. But this woman," he slammed his cane against the floor, "this woman earned every single one with her life." The hall erupted again, this time louder. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then spreading until it filled the room. The skepticism cracked, crumbled, replaced by respect. Emily stood slowly, her hands trembling. She wanted to thank them, to tell them how much their words meant, but her throat refused sound. Instead, she turned and met Hayes's eyes. He gave her a small nod, the kind of nod soldiers shared when words were unnecessary. For the first time that evening, Emily felt the weight on her shoulders ease. Not gone, not entirely, but lighter. She wasn't alone. Yet even amid the applause, not everyone was convinced. Some remained seated, arms crossed, their faces still etched with doubt. Daniel Rhodes in particular sat rigid, pen still scratching, already searching for a way to twist the testimonies into something less. But the tide had shifted. The narrative had changed. The truth was no longer hers alone to carry. It was shared by those who had lived it with her. The audience buzzed, but the energy was different now. Where suspicion once lingered, something new stirred curiosity, respect, even admiration. Emily straightened her posture, her chin lifting once more. The fire inside her burned steady now, fueled not by anger, but by solidarity. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe she might not have to fight this battle alone. And somewhere deep inside, for the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. The applause swelled again. The veterans remained standing, their presence a wall of truth no accusation could pierce. Emily Carter, once cornered, once doubted, stood taller than before. She hadn't spoken much. She hadn't needed to. Her allies had spoken for her, and in doing so, had reminded the world that sometimes honor isn't defended by words alone, but by those willing to rise beside you. And though the night wasn't over, though battles still waited, the truth had begun to shine through the cracks of doubt. The applause still echoed like distant thunder when the doors at the back of the hall burst open. The sound was sharp, commanding, not frantic, but deliberate, as if the world itself had decided to pause. Every head turned, every whisper died. Even the journalists fell silent, pens suspended mid-stroke. A figure stepped through the doorway. The President of the United States. Flanked by 2 Secret Service agents, his presence carried a weight no rumor could match. His stride was steady, measured, each footstep echoing across the polished floor like a gavel striking. For a moment, the hall forgot to breathe. Emily's heart jolted. She had been prepared for hostility, for whispers, for questions she couldn't answer. But this she had not anticipated. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She forced herself upright, spine rigid, though her palms grew damp. The President's gaze swept the room, cutting through the fog of confusion and doubt. It lingered on the cluster of veterans still standing, then shifted to Emily. His expression betrayed no emotion, but his eyes were sharp, searching, as though weighing not just the woman, but the truth of the moment. He reached the stage with unhurried steps. The MC scrambled aside, unsure whether to bow, salute, or simply vanish. Cameras snapped furiously, reporters whispering about the unprecedented interruption. "Ladies and gentlemen," the President's voice rang clear, firm and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the cavernous hall. "I did not come here to give a speech. I came because truth has been questioned. And when truth itself is in question, the responsibility to set it right becomes mine." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Daniel Rhodes's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the floor. His smirk was gone, replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. The President reached into the folder in his hand. Thick, official, its seal gleamed under the lights. He opened it slowly, deliberately. "Here," he said, "are records, not stories. Not whispers, official documentation of missions, of service, of sacrifice. Classified until now. Declassified only because falsehood has threatened to erase honor." He looked directly at Emily. Major Emily Carter's honor. Emily's. Breath caught. He began to read. Kandahar, 2012. Convoy ambushed. Sergeant William Hayes, wounded and pinned. Carter re-entered hostile fire and evacuated him under direct attack. Medical reports confirm her injuries. Records confirm his survival due to her actions. Murmurs surged. Hayes, still standing, with his cane, nodded through misty eyes. Fallujah, 2014, the President continued. Operation Iron Shield. Carter assumed command after her superior was incapacitated. Outnumbered, under fire, she orchestrated a maneuver that saved 2 units. Unit reports and field notes confirm her leadership prevented catastrophic losses. Every sentence struck like a hammer. Every fact was undeniable. The President's voice remained calm, unyielding. Aleppo, 2016. During a joint mission, Carter shielded a civilian child from grenade shrapnel, sustaining injuries that required 3 surgeries. Field medics' reports, eyewitness testimony, and hospital records confirm this. The younger veteran who had spoken earlier pressed his lips together, nodding firmly. The hall grew heavier with every revelation. Skepticism crumbled, piece by piece. The medals on Emily's chest were no longer in question. They were alive with proof. The president closed the file briefly, his eyes sweeping the crowd. I could go on. This folder contains not rumors, but truth, signed and verified by commanders, medics, and survivors. These medals are not decorations of vanity. They are acknowledgments of sacrifice you demanded she prove. His gaze sharpened, landing on Daniel Rhodes. And she was expected to prove it to whom? A journalist with an agenda? An audience too eager for scandal? Rhodes shrank into his seat, his cheeks pale. The room watched in collective silence. The president turned back to Emily. Major Carter, you are not supposed to defend yourself tonight. That burden was never yours to carry. Your service speaks for itself. Your brothers and sisters have spoken for you. Now the United States itself speaks for you. Emily's throat constricted. Her body trembled, yet her eyes stayed locked on him. In that moment, the years of doubt, the whispers, the pain of being questioned, all of it seemed to dissolve beneath the undeniable weight of truth spoken aloud. Then, breaking the silence, the president closed the folder with a sharp snap. The sound reverberated like a verdict delivered. He turned to the audience. Every medal you see here is earned. Every rumor you have whispered is false. And every second you doubted her was an injustice to a soldier who has given more than most of us can imagine. The hall erupted. Not whispers this time. Applause. Thunderous, unrestrained, unbroken. People rose to their feet, a wave of standing ovations, sweeping across the room. Journalists who had sharpened their pens for scandal now clapped with genuine awe. Even those who had crossed their arms in defiance could not resist rising with the tide of truth. Emily stood frozen, breath shallow, her chest aching. For years, she had shouldered her story in silence. Now the highest voice in the land had carried it for her. The veterans who had spoken earlier clapped the loudest, some wiping away tears. Hayes's cane tapped rhythmically against the floor as he clapped one-handed, his pride uncontained. Through the applause, the president turned once more to Emily. Major Carter, he said, his voice softer now but no less commanding. On behalf of this nation, I apologize for the doubt you endured. And I thank you not for the medals, but for the lives behind them. Her lips parted, but words failed her. Tears welled despite her struggle to hold them back. She managed only a nod, small but firm, filled with gratitude. The president extended his hand. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The gesture was simple, yet monumental. Cameras flashed, capturing the handshake that symbolized more than vindication. It was justice, recognition, truth laid bare. For Emily, it was also release, a burden lifted, a wound finally closing. The ovation did not stop. It rolled on, a wave of sound filling every corner of the hall, spilling into the corridors beyond. For the first time that night, no one questioned, no one doubted. Emily stood taller, her shoulders squared, the weight of years replaced with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, not arrogance, but the quiet pride of knowing that the truth had finally spoken louder than the lies. And yet, deep within her, she knew this was not just about her. It was about every soldier who had been doubted, every sacrifice reduced to rumor, every medal dismissed as decoration. Tonight was not just vindication. It was a reminder that truth, though delayed, always finds a voice. As the applause raged on, Emily glanced once more at the veterans who had stood for her. Their nods, their smiles, their silent solidarity. meant as much as the president's words. They had carried her when she could not carry herself. And in that moment, amid the storm of recognition, Emily Carter finally allowed herself to breathe. The president released her hand, stepped back, and let the ovation roar on. He had said what needed to be said. The rest now belonged to her. The ovation shook the hall like an earthquake. At first, it was scattered in uncertain clap here, a hesitant cheer there, but it gathered momentum, rising, swelling, until the sound became unstoppable. Thunderous applause roared across the room, echoing off marble walls and high ceilings. Emily Carter stood at the center of it all, her chest heaving, her palms trembling at her sides. Her medals caught the light with each breath, glimmering not as objects of doubt, but as symbols finally free of shadow. She had worn them into this hall like armor, braced for attack, yet now they shone like truth made visible. She blinked rapidly, her throat tight, her vision blurring as tears pressed to the surface. She had promised herself she would not cry, not in front of them. But the sound of hundreds rising to their feet, voices cheering what had once been ridiculed, this was more than vindication. It was freedom. On the front row, Daniel Rhodes sat rigid, his pen abandoned, his notebook forgotten. His expression was a battlefield of disbelief and humiliation. The smirk that had fueled whispers for months was gone, replaced by pale silence. His eyes darted to the crowd, then to the president, then reluctantly to Emily. When she met his gaze, he flinched. She did not gloat. She did not smile in triumph. She simply looked at him with quiet steadiness, the kind only truth affords. The veterans who had stood for her earlier clapped hardest of all. William Hayes, leaning on his cane, raised his other arm high and shouted her name over the roar. His voice cracked with emotion, but his pride was unmistakable. Younger soldiers echoed him, their chants swelling into rhythm. Carter! Carter! Emily's chest constricted. To hear her name shouted, not with skepticism but with honor, broke something open inside her. For years, her story had lived in classified files and hushed conversations. Now it belonged to the world. A president remained beside her, one hand lifted slightly to calm the crowd, but even he seemed reluctant to cut short the storm of applause. His presence, powerful as it was, seemed to fade into the background as the spotlight shifted entirely to her. He had spoken, he had revealed, but the moment belonged to Emily. As the cheers continued, Emily's mind raced through memories. The dust-filled streets of Kandahar, the burned-out buildings of Fallujah, the child in Aleppo whose frightened eyes still haunted her dreams. She remembered the heat of shrapnel tearing through her shoulder, the weight of comrades' blood on her hands, the silence of friends who never made it back. Each medal on her chest carried a story, and each story carried a name. And now, at last, those names were no longer shrouded in doubt. Her hand drifted unconsciously to one particular medal near her heart. The Bronze Star. It wasn't hers. Not truly. She had accepted it, but in her mind, it belonged to Lieutenant Harris, the commanding officer who had fallen in Fallujah, whose last command she had carried out. Without him, she wouldn't have lived. Without him, neither would the men she had saved. Tonight, the world applauded her, but in her heart, the applause was shared. The ovation ebbed slowly, then rose again, as if waves were crashing against the shore, unwilling to retreat entirely. Emily allowed herself a small smile, gentle, humble, but radiant in its sincerity. The cameras captured it instantly, flashes popping like fireworks. For the first time in years, the story they carried would not be of scandal or rumor, but of vindication. The MC, flustered but determined, returned to the podium. His voice trembled with awe. Ladies and gentlemen, let us once again honor Major Emily Carter, a soldier, a leader, a hero. The applause reignited, and Emily bowed her head slightly, unable to trust her voice against the tide of emotion swelling within her. She raised her eyes only when she felt a hand on her shoulder, the president's, firm and reassuring. "You carried the truth," he said softly, words only she could hear. "Tonight, the truth carried you." Emily swallowed hard, nodding. There were no words she could offer in return, no eloquence to capture the enormity of what had just unfolded. Her silence, however, was not emptiness. It was full of gratitude, full of release, full of the weight finally lifted from her shoulders. She turned her gaze back to the audience. The faces she had once dreaded to meet, reporters hungry for scandal, politicians eager for spectacle, civilians curious but skeptical, now looked at her with something new. Respect, awe, even shame from some, but shame born of realizing how wrong they had been to doubt. Daniel Rhodes shifted again in his seat, his jaw tightening. Emily wondered what story he would write now. Perhaps he would twist it. Perhaps he would cling to bitterness. But his narrative no longer mattered. Tonight, the truth was undeniable. The world had seen it with their own eyes, heard it from the highest authority. No pen, however venomous, could erase that. The ovation finally began to subside. People settled back into their seats, though many eyes remained fixed on Emily, unwilling to look away. The air was charged, electric, alive with the aftershock of revelation. The MC cleared his throat. "Major Carter, if you would." A few words. Her stomach tightened. A speech. She had dreaded this possibility. Public speaking was nothing compared to firefights or ambushes, yet somehow it always left her vulnerable. But this was not about eloquence. It was about honesty. She stepped forward, her boots echoing faintly on the wooden stage. The microphone waited. She drew a steadying breath. "I don't." Her voice cracked, and she paused, adjusting. "I don't know what to say. I didn't come here tonight to prove myself. I came because I was told to stand in the light, even if shadows followed. For years, I carried my story alone. Tonight, I didn't carry it alone anymore." She glanced toward the veterans who had stood for her. "You carried it with me." Her eyes swept the audience. "And now you carry it too." Silence filled the hall, heavy but reverent. "These medals," she touched her chest, "are not mine alone. They belong to every soldier who never made it home, to every civilian whose life was spared, to the brothers and sisters who stood with me when I was afraid. If you honor me tonight, honor them too." Her voice steadied, stronger now, each word clear and deliberate. "And to those who doubted, I don't hate you. Doubt is easy. Belief is harder, but belief is what saves lives. On the battlefield, I believed in the people beside me. That belief is the reason any of us stand here today." She stepped back. The silence broke like glass. Applause thundered once more, this time deeper, richer, shaped not only by vindication, but by respect. Emily's chest ached, but the ache was sweet. She had spoken not for herself, but for them, for the fallen, for the living, for the truth. The weight on her shoulders no longer felt like a burden. It felt like legacy. As she left the podium, the president inclined his head in acknowledgement. The veterans saluted. Even some reporters, awkwardly but sincerely, rose to their feet in respect. The ovation followed her as she returned to her seat. It was no longer the sound of noise, but of recognition that her truth was no longer hidden, no longer whispered, no longer doubted. Emily Carter had come into the hall carrying medals that felt like chains. She now sat with medals that gleamed as testaments. Vindication had come not in silence, but in thunder. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world finally saw her for who she truly was. The hall's lights dimmed slowly, the applause echoing like fading thunder until it melted into silence. One by one the guests departed, still murmuring about what they had witnessed. For many, it was the most extraordinary ceremony they had ever attended, an event that would be written about, argued over, and remembered for years to come. But Emily Carter did not linger to bask in the spotlight. She slipped out through a side corridor, her medals still pinned neatly against her uniform, though they now felt lighter than they ever had before. The air outside was crisp, carrying with it the faint hum of city traffic. A cool breeze brushed against her skin, as though the night itself sought to cool the firestorm she had just endured. For the first time in hours, there were no cameras, no chants, no questions thrown like darts, just silence. Emily exhaled, long and steady. The sound of her boots on the stone steps was strangely grounding. Every step away from the ceremony reminded her that life was not lived on stages, not captured in ovations. Life, real life, waited quietly beyond the headlines. She paused at the bottom of the steps. Across the plaza, reporters clustered behind barricades, eager for one last quote, one more photo to send racing across the world. But she chose another path, a quieter one, leading toward the darkened garden at the edge of the building. There, beneath the shadows of oaks and maples, she finally let herself breathe. Her hand drifted again to the bronze star near her heart. She whispered a name, Harris, soft enough that only the leaves could hear. Tonight the world had applauded her, but Emily knew the truth. Every story of valor was written by more than one pair of hands. Hers just happened to survive long enough to carry the pen. She closed her eyes and saw the faces of those who never made it home. Each medal was not a prize, but a gravestone etched into her chest. She wondered how many of the cheering crowd would understand that. Perhaps none. Perhaps it didn't matter. The crunch of footsteps on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, half expecting a reporter. Instead, she saw William Hayes, the elderly veteran with the cane. He approached slowly, his face lit faintly by the glow of the garden lamps. "You disappeared fast," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "I'm not much for crowds," Emily admitted. Hayes chuckled. "Neither was I, but tonight you stood taller than any crowd could measure. Don't forget that," she offered. A small, grateful nod. "Thank you for standing up earlier. It meant more than I can say." His eyes softened. "No thanks needed. I was just speaking the truth. You carried us out there, Carter. We carried you tonight." He tapped his cane gently against the gravel, then looked skyward. "Strange how life comes full circle, isn't it? One day you're fighting to survive, the next you're fighting to be believed." Emily swallowed hard. "And some fights never really end." Hayes placed a hand on her shoulder, steady despite his age. "Maybe not. But remember this. Your legacy isn't built on the battles you fought. It's built on the lives you touched. Don't let them reduce you to medals and rumors. You're more than both." The words settled into her like seeds, taking root. Hayes smiled once more, then turned and shuffled back toward the lights of the hall, leaving Emily alone beneath the trees. She sat on a bench, the night cool against her flushed skin. Above, the stars blinked faintly through the branches, distant, yet steady. She thought of all the years she had doubted herself, of the voices that had told her she didn't belong, of the whispers that claimed her truth was a lie. Tonight, those voices had been silenced. But what mattered most was not the silencing it, was that she had not let them break her before this night arrived. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out reluctantly. Dozens of missed calls, hundreds of messages. Some from reporters, others from strangers, and a few from old comrades who had watched the broadcast. Messages of pride. Messages of apology. Messages of awe. She scrolled briefly, then locked the screen. The noise could wait. Instead, she opened the gallery app and pulled up a photo one she rarely shared. It was of her unit, taken years ago, all of them standing shoulder to shoulder, dust on their uniforms and laughter in their eyes despite the weight of war. Many in the photo were gone now. But tonight, as she stared at their faces, she felt they were with her still. She whispered, "We made it." For the first time in years, the words didn't feel like a lie. Minutes passed. The garden remained still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. Emily let the quiet seep into her. Bones. The ceremony was over, but its echo would stretch far beyond this night. Tomorrow, the headlines would explode. Her name would trend across platforms she barely understood. Children would learn her story in classrooms. Veterans would feel pride in her vindication, and skeptics would be forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight was hers. She rose from the bench and began walking toward the street where her car waited. Each step felt lighter, freer, as though she were walking not away from the ceremony, but toward something new. At the curb, she paused once more and glanced back at the towering building behind her. The hall was still glowing, its windows alive with fading light. Somewhere inside, staff were cleaning up, collecting glasses, folding chairs, sweeping away. Confetti and programs. Soon, no trace of the evening would remain, except the memory. That, Emily realized, was legacy. Not the applause, not the medals, not even the president's words. Legacy was the imprint left behind when the lights went out and the stage was cleared. Legacy was what lived in others, what carried forward long after she was gone. She smiled, faintly at the thought. She had fought for years to be believed. Tonight, belief was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it. And that, she decided, was enough. She climbed into her car, the leather seat cool beneath her. As the engine hummed to life, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back was still Emily Carter, still scarred, still haunted, but lighter, freer, steadier. She whispered to her reflection, "It's over." But she knew it was not truly over. It was simply beginning again, in a different way. She would keep speaking, keep honoring the names of the fallen, keep reminding the world that medals were not trinkets, but testaments. Her story was not finished. It had only turned a page. The car pulled into the street, the city lights stretching ahead like a river of stars. Somewhere in the distance, fireworks cracked the night sky, whether in celebration of her or of some unrelated festivity she didn't know. But she smiled anyway. The night had given her back her truth, and with it, she carried forward not just vindication, but legacy. As the city blurred past her window, Emily Carter did not feel like the woman who had walked into that hall, weighed down by suspicion. She felt like the woman who had walked out carrying something far greater. Not medals, not applause, but freedom, and the quiet certainty that the world finally had seen her for who she truly was.